the first week, they're really doing well. These young boys from Alabama are holding their own. They're showing a lot of bravery. Kind of stupid. They would stand up in the advanced rifle pits and show their bravery and shoot at the other guys, and they would get shot. So a lot of them were getting wounded that first week. There was a lot of concern about these young Confederate boys, and you saw a lot of them were going to the hospital and for relatively minor injuries. But I think it was probably the surgeons that were there. I don't have anything to prove this, but I think they were kind of concerned about their well-being, and I do think they probably sensed the war was coming to an end, and they just wanted to protect the boys. That was the idea. So they sent these boys up to Blakely, and they transferred in everybody's favorite Alabamian, James Thaddeus Holtzclaw, lawyer from Montgomery. His veterans, they come down, Holtzclaw's brigade, and then from French's division, you have Julius Andrew, who's now in charge of Hector's brigade. So these veterans of the Army of Tennessee replaced these young boys who go up to Blakely to give these young boys a reprieve. Didn't accomplish much because a day later, Fred Steele shows up at Fort Blakely with his column from Pensacola. So they didn't accomplish much. So you got the veterans there now. Now, there's no photographs from Spanish Fort that I've ever been able to find, but I found a lot of drawings from diaries and that sort of thing. And I have a lot in my book. This is one. This is a gum tree mortar. I've actually I had a cousin that worked for the Minnesota Historical Society, and he took me in the back. They kind of seems like they try to hide their Civil War history, but they have a lot of artifacts, and they actually have a gum tree mortar. And I've seen it, and I've touched it, and everything. It was built by these Minnesota pioneers from Baldwin County Gumtree in Baldwin County, but it's still there. They don't have it on display. I'm hoping we could at least have it loaned to the museum that they're going to put at Blakely in the future. But I was so excited about this Gumtree mortars. I thought how cool. They would really light. They could take them up to the advanced rifle pits, and both sides had versions of them. They would lob shells at each other, and both sides talked about how effective they were. And I was giving this talk a few years back to the Vicksburg Civil War Roundtable, and there's a lady there who volunteers with the national park at Vicksburg, and you could tell she was just kind of like. I said, "Yes, ma'am," and she says, "We had those here." And I was carrying on about how cool they were, and it was like they had them at Vicksburg too, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But I thought it was cool. So here's another one. This gives you an idea how close they were. That would be the Confederate fort. These are Union soldiers, and they basically put a coat and a hat on a stick or a tree limb, and they would sit there and they'd taunt each other. And both sides would. Everybody talks about how everybody likes to make fun of the Southern accent. The Yankees definitely did that. They made fun of the Southerners' accent, but the Southerners also made fun of their accent. They would say, "Hello, how you doing over there, guys?" That kind of thing, and they would just go back and forth and taunt each other. But they were very, very close in a lot of places. I mean, really close. They could have conversations. Bomb proofs. This was from C.C. Andrews. This is a year afterwards. They would build into the hills of Spanish Fort. And then, you see some guys in there. You see the legs sleeping. This guy looks like he's on a chair. This guy's up against a tree stump, and he looks like he's either reading or writing a letter. So that would have been some scenes from the battle. But probably one of the more unique features of this battle would have been torpedoes. And I alluded to this before. The torpedoes sunk the Tecumseh during the Battle of Mobile Bay. But it was not as, but when it comes to the Mobile campaign, that's where the real damage comes. There was another vessel called the Narcissus that was sank in December of 64 in Mobile Bay. But at this point, the Battle of Spanish Fort, the Navy is going to be in for a rude awakening. Okay, and the forts around Mobile were adequate. The problem is they didn't have enough men to man them, and that's ultimately what cost them. But it wasn't because of the Navy. The Navy played very little role. Not until the very last day of the siege did the Navy get in position where they could lob some shells into the southern portions of Spanish Fort. These torpedoes And they said the most effective were the beer keg torpedoes. Mobile's the founding place of Mardi Gras, like to party, and they like to not waste stuff too. So after they get finished drinking, they make bombs out of their beer kegs. But this came out of Mobile Bay, and it's now at the Atlanta. Some relic hunter found it in Mobile Bay and thought it would be a good idea to bring it to Atlanta. I don't think it was a good idea. I think it needs to be in Mobile, where it belongs. But anyways, it's in Atlanta. Some guy came down there and took our stuff and has it displayed there. Anyway, it's an anchor. So this is the Tecumseh. The Milwaukee. It's a double-turreted, state-of-the-art James Eads river monitor, shallow draft. Brought in, they used, I believe this was in the Red River campaign as well. So they bring them over to Mobile Bay. They're advancing up, get to about 1.25 miles off of south of Spanish Fort along the eastern shore, and hits a torpedo. Boom! The next day, the Osage, also from the Red River campaign, boom! Hits 2 days. 2 Union warships that had survived Red River are down, sunk in Mobile Bay. A couple days pass. Rudolph hits it's a gunboat, tin-clad riverboat. Hits a mine, or what we would call a mine today. So in 5 days, 3 vessels go down. And Admiral, if you look at some of the letters not meant for publication, a lot of the naval officers are saying they expect Thatcher, who taken Farragut's place, to be replaced because they were losing vessels at an alarming rate. So he's having a rough go of it. No, he didn't have time to do it.
No, he did get replaced.
He did get replaced, yeah.
He did?
He did not.
Yeah.
No, he did. He did not. But they didn't have time to send down a replacement. I mean, it was a lot of grumbling about him.
I would tell you Wells wasn't replaced.
Yeah. Was
an aggressive commander.
yeah. He was not aggressive in Mobile, and his officers would disagree.
Oh, this guy loses 3 ships and he's not aggressive.
He's aggressive, but he stopped. Here's what happens next. Nothing. Nothing. Nothing.
Yeah. Now you're making sense.
Yeah, nothing. He was aggressive at that point, but he got to about 1.25 miles. It stops. And you can't really, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? And that gets back to my guy, von Schiller. Doesn't get credit for it. That was his defensive plan. You don't ever hear about him. But he wrote a treatise on coast defense afterwards that was digested by all the top military leaders of the world.
So he didn't have the same problem with the torpedoes further back in the bay that he had at the end.
Right. And of course, he would have came in just before the Mobile campaign. Farragut had been in charge. And
I'm talking about the torpedoes. You said the torpedoes failed at the mouth.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. And here, it's a good point. I talked about the crustaceans, the currents at the mouth of Mobile Bay, very strong. Salt water, a lot more saltier when you get up further up at the northern part, particularly when you get to the Blakely River. That's more brackish water. So, and the currents aren't as strong.
So that's why he had better success, right?
Yeah, it was more conducive to that, But also, even if he could have gotten up to the battery, they had these 10 rows of pilings going across, barring the entrance to the river. And you have an artillery position just beyond that. I mean, they had a hell of a time removing those obstructions without being fired at.
Right.
But this is all von Schiller. Okay, so the Navy, I guess my point to you here is the Navy was completely neutralized. The only thing they were doing was bringing in supplies and taking out wounded and maybe some prisoners. They up until April 1st, they didn't advance any further. I say that on April 8th, the final day of the siege, some of the gunboats, after they had dragged the area, they got to where they could finally close enough that they could lob some shells into southern portion of the fort in the very last day. But he was just, he couldn't do anything, you know. And everybody is saying this. The Army, letter after letter. Oh, God, the Navy's just so timid right now and everything else. What do you do? If you lose 2 ships or 3 ships in 5 days, I would probably be a little timid too. You know, he loses 11 guys. He loses not 11, 9. Now, a lot of them are going to go down after the fort has been captured. All right, but it was a huge eye opener for the military. I can show you some quotes from some of these guys about. One of the guys said, you know, if I ever have to be in charge of defending a coast, give me the guy who designed the defenses of Mobile Bay as my assistant, and I'll defend any place you want. Just give me that guy. And these are not meant for. These are private letters, not meant for distribution. So I'm kind of intrigued by this von Schiller. He was trained, or was not trained. Gabriel Rains came to Mobile Bay and taught him how to deploy them, how to use those. So they very much neutralized the Navy. Okay, so we're moving up to battery. This is redoubt number 3. This is where the 5th Company of Washington Artillery is located. Lieutenant Chalaron, who was one of the officers of that battery, he drew this. I thought it was a pretty good map. If you look at the details, he drew that during the siege. The battery is still there. I remember I mentioned that it's in the backyards. If you look in the backyards, you can see it. If you don't know what you're looking at. And now the 5th Company of Washington Artillery was these were light artillerists. They did field artillery. And at Spanish Fort, they have to man heavy guns, and they don't like that. But they have one cannon. It's a Columbiad, I believe an 8-inch Columbiad, and that cannon was the kind of the big gun right in the middle of the defenses. It caused a lot of destruction. Hit a limber box of the 14th Indiana, caused a huge explosion, and they named it the Lady Slocum after their captain's wife, Captain Slocum of New Orleans. And as I mentioned before, if you go, those batteries are still there, right there along the street. Okay, and I talked about that. There was a New York Times correspondent was there, and he had been everywhere, Vicksburg, Shiloh, you name it, on the Western Theater. And he said that single shot from the Lady Slocum caused the most destruction he had seen in the entire war. It was a horrible carnage that was left after that limber box exploding, killed, and just, it was really awful. The pretty gory details, actually. The guy who fired that shot this is Corporal Fox. That picture was taken right after the war. And one of the guys who was wounded manning it, I actually have an account of him being shot. And I found this picture from a doctor in New Orleans who collects these images, and he let me use it for the book. But he got shot in the arm, and there he is, his arm's in the sling. So I have an account of that. So I believe it was April 4th, after they blew up the limber box, the artillery batteries concentrated their fire on Redoubt 3 and knocked the right trunnion off the cannon. They propped it up temporarily with a rod and filled it with, I believe, a canister, expecting a charge. It doesn't come. They bring up a replacement cannon. They put that cannon on the ground. In 1891, these are veterans, the Blue-Gray Union. These are Union and Confederate veterans. They go back to the battlefield and they find the cannon, which they knew it would have been a famous cannon, and see the right trunnions knocked off. And they bring it to Mobile as a peace monument. They put it right there on Government Street in downtown Mobile. There it is. And when they dedicated this peace monument, they invited veterans of the 5th Company to come to Mobile for the unveiling or the dedication. And these guys with the 5th Company, a lot of them had a lot of money and influential members of New Orleans society. They come over, they want that cannon. And the Blue-Gray Union's like, nah. They had a meeting afterwards where they appealed, hey, we got guys that were killed over this cannon. It means a lot to us. We want to bring it back and dedicate it to Captain Slocum, who's since passed. And the Mobile guy's like, no. Well, they didn't give up. It's a long story, but the vice president of the Blue-Gray Union was a Confederate veteran. His name was Thomas Pinckney Brewer right here. And then this gentleman right here was the president, and he was a doctor. His name is just escaping me at the moment. But anyways, they became good friends, and then they had a falling out, and they got in a shotgun duel down by Fort Morgan. And Brewer killed the Union doctor, and so the vice president killed the president of this peace society that was meant to bring peace between the Yankees and in Mobile. So I didn't hear much. I don't know exactly how that left the organization, but you don't hear anything else about the Blue-Gray Peace Union afterwards. So my theory is that it was dissolved. That's what I think happened. The person who paid for the cannon to be transported to Mobile was somehow technically the owner. And I've seen in his a guy named Badgeron. He owned some apartments that he leased out in Mobile. But anyways, he passes away, and his kids, they could care less about this cannon. Well, these guys from New Orleans are real persistent. They want that cannon back, right? So they put it up for bid, and Mobile lost the cannon. A lot of people don't realize what happened. If you ask the old time, it was stolen. They came in the night and stole it and brought it to New Orleans. So if you go to New Orleans today, you go outside of the Civil War Museum on Camp Street, right across from the World War II Museum, you'll see that cannon. And this was at Spanish Fort. And in the Texas, remember I talked about Ector's Brigade? They donated this granite from Texas Granite. They donated this that the cannon rests on. And that sign is erroneous. It says that it came from Selma. And it didn't come from Selma. It came from the Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia. But that's what it says in the cannon. So there you go. All right. So after a 2-week siege, the 8th Iowa, who was captured at Shiloh by Holtzclaw's brigade, they launch an attack on the northern flank of Spanish Fort. And they capture a position, and they capture about 300 yards of the fort at right around dusk. They throw up a perpendicular trench, which is still there. It's highly eroded, but it's still there. And they fortify there, and there's a couple counterattacks and charges. And this is what it looks like. You know, this is not a period drawing. The director of the museum at Faro drew this and let me use it in the book. So they attack. They gain this position. Now, at this point, the Confederates are operating under a Fabian policy. Okay? They didn't want to make the mistake that was made at Vicksburg, where you lose Vicksburg and you lose your garrison. Not good for business, right? The idea at this point is to hold out as long as you can, but don't sacrifice your garrison for any position. So before this siege even took place, the General Gibson was under orders to not risk his garrison. He had those orders right from the get-go. You know, don't risk your garrison. Hold out as long as you can, but don't risk your garrison. So what they had, and they worked on this throughout the siege. They were finished up. They had this very long treadway, a narrow treadway pier that was disguised by the reeds, the marsh reeds. And I can take you and I can show you where I can actually tell you when it's low tide, you can still see the end of it where it terminated into Blakely River. I've found that most people don't know where it's at, but I do. Over 2,000 men escaped in a single file line. They'd take their shoes off. They could hear the federal troops. I mean, look, there's the lodgeman right here, and they're marching like right down through here, and they could hear them talking. So it was really, if this battle had taken place in 1862 or 63, it would be it would be known much better than it is. One of the great escapes of the war. Okay, all to no avail because the war ends shortly thereafter. But nevertheless, it was You talk to military historians, and one of the hardest things you do is to execute a large-scale evacuation in the face of an enemy, right? I hear that a lot. All right, so there's our guy again that you guys didn't know who he was, Isaac W. Patton, 22nd Louisiana. He goes over and he takes command, direct command of Battery UG and Tracy. Fort Blakely falls the next day, April 9th. These two batteries had been inflicting a lot of damage on the 16th Corps during the first week of the siege. They were told to hold their fire because they didn't have a lot of ammunition, you know. And they figured they were going to need them in case of an emergency. And the emergencies come, they're given the order to open all guns and fire at will at occupied Spanish Fort. The Union now has Spanish Fort. So that's what they do on April 10th and all day on the 11th. They don't hold anything back, and they're bombarding the heck out of the Spanish Fort. Now, he's the only Patton that survived. He had an older brother that was a drunk and didn't serve, but their other brothers were killed, including the father of George Patton. That would have been his uncle from World War II fame. It's interesting. Patton says fixed fortifications are a testament to man's stupidity, but you know his great uncle did pretty well at Spanish Fort or the Battery UG and Tracy. He goes on to become mayor of New Orleans afterwards. So here are a couple drawings. This is Battery UG, and you can see that these will be the bombardment, and then these are I believe these are Federal soldiers running for cover at Spanish Fort. Here's another drawing. These are Federal soldiers running for cover from the bombardment. Those 2 days at Spanish Fort from Battery UG and Tracy. So everybody wants to know about casualty. I did a lot of, and I had some help on this as well. The Confederates, I think they originally recorded about 92 were killed. I found between 97 and 99. A couple of them I couldn't confirm. I heard accounts they did, but I couldn't find where they were buried, so I'm not 100% sure on a couple guys. About 519 were sent to Ship Island. Okay, and the last day of the siege, there was 2,600 guys. 2,616 men were there on the final day of the siege. That number fluctuated here and there throughout the siege. Union reports varied between 540 and 600 men were captured. I guess you could surmise that 20 or so were sent to hospitals that might have been wounded seriously, and they don't make it to Ship Island. That's there. Now,
you had the 2,000 that escaped.
Yeah, roughly 2,000.
2,000 to begin with.
No. They had 2,616. 2,616. They had 6,000 at the fight at Doe Leaf Creek. Half of those men go to Blakely. So there's about 3,400 at Blakely. There's about 2,600 in round numbers at Spanish Fort, of which about 540, I think, were captured based on the reports. About 519 end up at Ship Island. Question?
You said 2,000 that slipped away on that.
Right. About 2,000.
They evaded capture. And
that's right. So 2,100, roughly. These are round numbers. I don't know the precise number, but I think it's roughly, in round numbers, about 2,100 men out of 2,600 escaped, which is pretty remarkable under the circumstances. That was, and they didn't know about that treadway. A lot of the guys didn't want to leave. They're like, we're going to fight it out. All right, now the Federals, this is interesting, is you got to be careful. Guys, the official records are not gospel. You have to understand that, okay? They're not gospel. And a lot of times these guys lie. A lot of times in the newspaper reports especially, it's BS. Now sometimes it's accurate. Sometimes it is, but you have to discern and you have to verify, right? Trust but verify. Now, the Union reports that can be issued, 52 were killed. Now, obviously, you got to give them a break because some of those guys were mortally wounded. All right? I found 129. I know where they're buried, and most of the cases I know how they were killed. More than double the number that was reported. All right? Carr's division, Eugene Carr's division suffered the most. That's of the 16th Army Corps. And remember those batteries? I didn't talk about this a lot in this talk, but early in the siege, when they were fortifying, they received a heavy bombardment from the Confederate vessels, The Nashville was partial ironclad. The Morgan that survived the Battle of Mobile Bay, and the CSS Huntsville and Tuscaloosa at different times were bombarding that northern flank. Okay, they eventually erected the First Indiana erected a battery to silence those gunboats, and they did. But Eugene and Tracy stopped firing because they didn't have the ammunition. They didn't realize the damage that they were causing to the 16th Corps. It was pretty brutal. Both sides, about 230 men lost their lives. A lot of them died later on. They're mortally wounded in hospitals in New Orleans and elsewhere. Okay, a lot of them are buried in Greenwood Cemetery in New Orleans. Most are buried at Mobile's Magnolia Cemetery. Okay, but 230 men died. There's a national cemetery at Mobile's Magnolia Cemetery. They have a section, they call it the National Cemetery. The greater, like I would call it Magnolia Cemetery, but they have Confederate Rest, and then a little further over they have the National Cemetery. So you have the guys that were killed at Blakely and Spanish Fort. Also, you had some from other wars. They're also buried there as well, later on. But it's really a fascinating. There's a lot of people buried there. Braxton Bragg is one of them. Danville Ledbetter is another. I mean, I think there's like 4 or 6 generals that are buried there in Mobile. Now, Randall Lee Gibson, both sides praised his performance. I always like to see what the Union generals say about him, and the garrison commander, General Gibson, was competent, active, inspired his troops with enthusiasm. If you're looking for leadership under fire, if you go through my book, especially my first one, The Last Siege, I talk in detail about the tactics that he did to, one, suppress any desertion, things he did to make sure he had secret police deployed, make sure no one was deserting, and he was ruthless in that regard. But he also did a lot of things to motivate his officers to keep his men's morale high. He did a lot of things, including dispensing whiskey rations at one point during the war. But if you look at some of his leadership there, I think it's pretty respectable. And then this is Richard Taylor. He talks about, he mentions the skillful retreat, make this one of the best achievements of the war. All right, so after Blakely and Spanish Fort falls, it leads to the ceasefire armistice in Cushla, which is Pritchard, Alabama. Okay, there General Canby meets Richard Taylor, and they agree to a ceasefire. And Canby offers the same terms that Johnston was offered by Sherman in North Carolina, same exact terms, which the very next day he has to send a telegraph and say, those terms I offered you yesterday, I can't. It was overruled by Washington. Stanton, right, exactly. Stanton was livid about it. So Canby was embarrassed. Now, interesting is Richard Taylor was his father's secretary during the Mexican War, and Canby served under Zachary Taylor during the Mexican War. So these guys knew each other well. So when they met, it was just kind of like, hey, these are guys they knew intimately. Canby had been stationed in Mississippi after the war. So they knew each other. Now, interesting enough, this is a photoshopped image. Did you know that? This is actually General Gordon's uniform. And this is the civilian picture of Richard Taylor, and they photoshopped it on top of the uniform. And I was embarrassed. A gentleman wrote a book about Richard Taylor recently, and he put that on the cover. I also included it in my first book, and I found out afterwards. There's just a little picture in there, but this guy put it on the cover of his book. But that is Photoshop. It's a cool picture, though. All right, so let's talk about that surrender a little bit. After they had the agreement, they had this thing, and Richard Taylor's like, what do we do? Yeah, he knew the gig was up. There's enough bloodshed. He recognized that, and he agreed to the terms that was offered to General Lee. So they decide to have another meeting, this time in Centinel, Alabama, along the M&O rail line. And they meet there, and this is one of the only surrender of a significant force outside. Didn't take place inside. They went under this oak tree. It's no longer there. Someone has told me, I don't know, I can't sustain. I've seen a painting. I don't think it was a period painting of Stan Waddy surrendering outside too. I don't know. I have never researched that. I don't know if that's accurate. I think Stan Waddy, I have not researched it again, but I think he had about a little over 2,000 men, give or take. That's what I heard. Again, I haven't looked at it extensively. But what I would argue with you guys is the last actual surrender of the war, of a significant intact force, Centinel, Alabama. You know, you say, oh, what about the Trans-Mississippi? Well, they had already disbanded. Kirby Smith didn't even show up. It was Richard Taylor who surrendered them in New Orleans. That was, yeah, technically later, but that was to clear the books. I would say the last actual surrender was at Centinel. This would have been the remnants of the Mobile garrison. They had fell back to Meridian, and also Forrest's cavalry was all surrendered at Centinel. So, yeah, I would make that argument. All right, and there's a surrender site. Whenever I give this talk up north, I gave this talk up in Minnesota, and said, war between the states? What is that? Is that what you guys call it? So, anyways, now this is what Spanish Fort looks like today. This is kind of the neighborhood. This is actually a little bit older. There's another map that you can kind of go through and see. There's lots of historical signage, but it's still there intact. And if you're interested in learning more about Civil War era Mobile, I have lots of different topics, whether it's the Hun League, Admiral Sims, the Battle of Mobile Bay, Spanish Fort, and Blakely. I have a YouTube channel that talks about a lot of these locations that I mentioned today. It's not high production value. It's just I take my cell phone out and kind of say, hey, this is where this was. And then I have a Facebook group page. Even both of them are free. And if you're interested in the topic, I talk a lot about that. I have a few books here, if anybody's interested. The Last Siege, and then this is my latest one, the Civil War Siege of Spanish Fort. Questions? Sorry.